Work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, State of the Nation tonight. A top accountancy chief has warned net zero will mean higher energy bills for a decade. I will be joined by the infamous Phoebe Plummer, who poured tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers. What could possibly go wrong? Vox Populi Vox Dei. We asked the great people of Belfast, do you think that the net zero agenda is making energy more expensive? And here's a taste of what they had to say.
Of course it is. It's rising like stink, isn't it?
Wise words from the man in Belfast. And the new leader of the SNP has been told to hit the ground running. Let's just hope he doesn't have to fall on his sword like his predecessor. And an important GB News exclusive, a rare stroke of justice for one of the many victims of grooming gangs we have seen across the country. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our acclaimed panel, historian Dr. Tessa Dunlop and barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes. As ever, I want to hear from you. Please get in touch by emailing mailmog@gbnews.uk. But before all of that, as so often, it's been a busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Our top story on GB News tonight, Nicola Sturgeon says Humza Yousaf will be outstanding as the new leader of the Scottish National Party. At 37, he becomes the youngest First Minister and first to come from an ethnic minority background. Scotland's Health Secretary claimed victory over Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan with 52% of the vote. He says he's honoured to be taking on the role.
I'm not just humbled of that, I most certainly am. I also feel like the luckiest man in the world to be standing here as the leader of the SNP, a party I joined almost 20 years ago and that I love so dearly.
The Prime Minister says he's taking a zero-tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour. Rishi Sunak has unveiled a £160 million scheme that includes forcing offenders who commit graffiti or vandalism to clean up their own communities. The government says laughing gas will also be banned by the end of the year, becoming a Class C drug. The Prime Minister said current restrictions on nitrous oxide aren't working.
What we're going to do over the course of the spring and the summer is consult on the best way to do this to make sure that it is effective. Tackling supply is important. That's why we've gone out after county line gangs and disrupted 3,500 of them. It's why we've toughened up sentencing for drug supply. It's why the police have got these things called Project Adder, for example, which is a national programme to target drug gangs in particular. So all of those things help deal with supply.
Thousands of civil servants and public sector workers are staging fresh walkouts next month. The PCS union says more than 130,000 members are striking on April the 28th in a long-running dispute over pay, pensions and job security. Now, in the United States, 3 children and 3 members of staff have been killed in a shooting at a school in Tennessee. The 28-year-old female attacker was shot dead by police who say she'd been armed with at least 2 semi-automatic rifles and a handgun. The Covenant School, a private Christian elementary school, has around 200 students aged 3 to 11 years old. And staying with international news, in Israel, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, will delay his controversial judicial overhaul after widespread rallies. Hundreds of thousands of people have been taking to the streets in protest at the proposals, which they say will weaken the courts. The Prime Minister's hard-right coalition partner, Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, says the plans will now be looked at after the Passover parliamentary recess. The UK has welcomed the decision, with the Foreign Secretary now urging all parties to find common ground. And the government's launching an investigation into an oil spill in Poole Harbour in Dorset after concerns were raised by MPs for nearby nature reserves and fisheries. Yesterday, around 200 barrels of fluid, including crude oil, leaked from a pipeline operated by the gas company Perenco, which was immediately shut down. That's all from me. I'm back at 9. Now back to Jacob.
Today, a chief economist at one of Britain's top accountancy firms warned that net zero will cause hugely inflated energy bills for the next decade. The Big Four accountancy firm said that energy bills were likely to remain around 93% higher over the next decade than in the 2 years before Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, getting to net zero is not an unreasonable policy objective. Reducing carbon emissions, using fuel efficiently is a sensible thing to do. But is it right to do it on the backs of the least well-off and making our businesses uncompetitive? No country has ever prospered by putting burdens on itself. That actually cheap energy over not just decades but over hundreds of years has allowed society to become richer, which solves so many of the problems of society. Life expectancy increases in richer countries, but net zero is making us poorer. It is harming our economy, and of course it's the least well-off in society who suffer the most from higher prices because they spend more of their income on energy than those who are higher up the income scale. And in terms of competitiveness, if we stop producing, we still buy goods that are going to be made in countries that are less concerned about environmental issues, such as China. We put burdens on ourselves and then import from countries that are less concerned. So that becomes a self-defeating mantra that instead of improving things, we make things globally worse because we become poor and less competitive and others profit. And the war in Ukraine shows how dangerous this is because Europe became enormously reliant on a foreign totalitarian state's energy policy. And once it changed because we weren't willing to do things for ourselves, prices went up, people were squeezed, industry was squeezed. And Germany obviously suffered from this, but it affected the whole European economy and it's affected people in this country. And it has to be said that the proponents of net zero, the ones who want us to go further and faster, tend to be wealthy left-wing elites who are actually pretty insulated, not an intended pun, but nonetheless insulated against the effects of increasing prices because they're well enough to afford it. So when we have people, working men and women, protesting against the draconian measures that are coming in by the mayor this summer, they are taking the law into their own hands by damaging cameras that will implement the ULEZ scheme. People are saying that they don't want to be penalised for doing things that they think are perfectly reasonable. And this ties in then with the lawyers who we'll be talking about later, who have decided that they're not going to obey the law. They're not going to follow the very long-standing tradition of the cab rank rule, where lawyers take up the next case comes to them, including the infamous Mr. Foxkiller, who we hope might come on to defend himself, but I think he's too frightened of GB News to do this. They don't want to enforce the law. People don't want to be penalised and don't want to be poorer, and yet that's what net zero is doing. This is a really unfortunate way of making things worse in what is a resource-rich country. We have the North Sea oil and gas fields that we can pull more out of, but we also have the opportunity through shale gas to ensure we have plenty of cheap energy. And it seems to me that we have to get our act together so that we have an energy policy that is cheap energy until we have the technology and we have the systems that will allow us to move towards net zero. Currently, we are putting the cart before the horse. In some ways, you might say we are flying too close to the sun and we are at the risk of the wax melting, the wings falling off, and the economy crashing to ground. But that's enough of what I think. Vox Populi, Vox Dei, we asked the good people of Belfast, do you think that the net zero agenda is making energy more expensive? And the people have spoken.
I think we've definitely got issues with this zero, and it's not obtainable in quite a lot of decades. It's not acceptable that we are paying all this money for energy when we could do more in our own country.
Oh, 100%. It's ridiculous. They put it up. Really feeling it.
Of course it is. It's rising like stink, isn't it? Well, electricity is probably the worst one, but also we're on gas as well, propane gas, and that's gone up an awful lot.
But as always, I want to know what you think. Please get in touch. Mail me at mailmog@gbnews.uk. But I'm really delighted to be joined by Just Stop Oil spokesman Phoebe Plummer. Thank you for coming in, because I know you don't agree with me. How do you square the circle that people want to be more prosperous, they want to lead comfortable lives, but you're saying it's absolutely urgent we stop emissions now? How do you make the two work?
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for having me on. As you say, I'm Phoebe. I'm 21 and I'm a student from London and a supporter of Just Stop Oil. And I wonder why you think it's incompatible to help people with the cost of living crisis and to switch to renewables, which are 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels. Can you name me one of your viewers who is suffering the consequences of the cost of living crisis, who doesn't want their energy bills to be 9 times cheaper right now?
Well, unfortunately, that's not what's happening, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and you need to have fossil fuel backup to make up the gap. About half our energy every day is still coming from natural gas. Where's that going to come from?
Well, why aren't we implementing renewable technology? The largest solar farm in the UK was built in 6 weeks.
But it's not
it takes up to 28 years for any oil to come out of the ground in the North Sea.
But it's not going to produce any energy at night. That's the problem with renewables, is that they don't provide the base load that you need.
We already have the capacity to provide so much of our energy from renewables without any technology needed for storage solutions.
But where is this coming from? Because when the wind doesn't blow, when we had really cold days, we were reliant on importing from the EU, on coal and on gas. How are we going to replace that in the short term?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I am doing is listening to what all the experts are saying. We're living in this insane world where the experts aren't being listened to. The United Nations has called for no more oil and gas. The International Energy Agency has said we can have no new oil and gas. The IPCC report, the largest global report on the climate crisis, have all said we can have no new oil and gas. How many more experts need to say it?
Because we can't do it tomorrow. What are we going to do in terms of transport? That we still need petrol for cars and we need diesel for lorries. How are we going to get goods into supermarkets without this?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the world, and we're living the effects of the climate crisis today. Right now, people are dying. Children are starving. Families are fleeing their homes.
But energy...
And it's preventable. We have the solutions.
Cheap energy is one of the things that has hugely extended life expectancy by the ability to control temperatures, whether this is by air conditioning or by heating, the ability to store food more effectively, the ability to transport food, and indeed use fertilisers to grow more food, has all been essential in increasing life expectancy. Taking all that away would be disastrous for life expectancy.
Do you know what's essential in keeping our food supply? Tackling the climate crisis. This year we lost 1/3 of our wheat crops, half of our potato crops, and it's only going to get worse. We're heading to a future where people are going to be fighting over the last loaves of bread at Lidl.
But the only way we get our wheat crop is by putting the fertilisers on that come from fossil fuels. How are we going to replace that? That the productivity of organic farming is so much lower than of modern farming methods. We cannot feed the world on organic farming, and you must know that.
How do you expect to feed the world when our crops are destroyed by droughts, floods, wildfires, storms?
You've always had weather events that have affected crops, but that actually using fossil fuels for fertilisers and moving on to genetic modification of crops has enormously increased the yield. That since Malthus rate, we've increased agricultural productivity by about 2% per annum. And this is what is allowing people to get extended life expectancy because they've got more certainty of food. And this all depends on cheap energy, which has come from fossil fuels.
Jacob, you have 6 children. Do you not care about their future? Do you not care about them being able to feed themselves? Because right now, under this government's policies, your 6 children are heading towards a future that is filled with life-threatening extreme weather events, crop failures, famine, war. Suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
I think you've taken the evidence for an evolving climate and then applied it in an extraordinarily extreme way and are forgetting about the enormous advantages.
I can't believe you're talking to me about an evolving climate.
Well, the climate is...
People are dying.
But this is
Do you
a statement...
know how many people are suffering around the world?
What evidence is there that this is because we're using fossil fuels, that the climate evolves, but more people die each year from cold than from heat, as you know?
Have you read the IPCC report? What do you mean? What science?
But in terms, you're making extreme claims, but you're suggesting by not using fossil fuels, we would not produce the food we need to feed the world population.
I'm suggesting that if we keep on heading down this genocidal path of mass destruction, then no, there won't be any foods in the supermarket. Then we will see vast swathes of the world uninhabitable. We will see mass displacement of people.
But if you took out fossil fuels tomorrow, you would simply not have the productivity of agriculture you need to feed 8 or 9 billion people. And that would be tomorrow. And I'm not saying you shouldn't reduce emissions. I'm not arguing that. I'm simply saying you must do it when you have the technology to replace the energy that you're using. Because otherwise, all the consequences you're arguing for will happen immediately. We will simply not have the food we need to feed the population of the world.
Jacob, you know we're not asking for the taps to be turned off tomorrow. All of you know that. We're asking for an end to all new fossil fuel licences, in line with what climate scientists around the world are saying.
But if you turn it off for new licences now, you're requiring a change that is going to happen before we have the technology in place to substitute for it. So you may be delaying it by a few years, but this has to be a rational process to do it once you've got the technology sorted out, and we haven't got the technology yet.
So I understand you're an economics man. Yes. So
well, I'm interested in economics.
Yeah. So I've done some maths for you. I hope you don't mind. I looked up your net worth online. It's quite easy to find.
It's not actually true. It's easy to find, but it's not actually true.
In the hundreds of millions.
But that's not.
It costs around £20,000 to insulate a British home. So that's 8,000 British homes for your 150 net million, which is what it says online.
Which is untrue. But
do you really think that you're worth more than 8,000 cold, freezing families?
Have you seen the studies on insulation? That insulation...
Do you care about the people living in fuel poverty?
Very much so. When I was Secretary of State for Energy, I was responsible for developing the plan that has brought energy prices down for families. That was policy that I was intimately involved in designing, so of course I care about that.
So you do understand the report that you're asking me about says that the cost of insulating British homes is so expensive because of the government's failure to insulate British homes.
But what happens 3 years after people have insulated their homes? They use the same amount of energy as they did before. There's been a study on this, which I'm sure you've seen reports on. In the first year, they save money. In the second year, they save a small amount of money. In the third year, they have actually made themselves warmer because the economics of it is they have a certain amount they can spend on energy.
What happens when the government fails to insulate British homes? 7.5 million British people live in fuel poverty. Parents are starving themselves so that they can feed their children, and people are freezing to death in their homes because they are forced to choose between heating and eating. People are dying. Are you hearing me?
Because it's simply not true. The government introduced a cap on energy prices and support for families who couldn't afford energy prices, that those were brought in last year, and they are very significant supports to ensure...
What do you mean it's not true? Have you spoken to an ordinary person who is suffering the cost of living crisis right now?
I don't believe there's any such thing as ordinary people. I believe everybody is in their individual way quite remarkable. I think ordinary people is the most condescending way of referring to our fellow British citizens.
Well, of course you don't relate to the ordinary people. You're a millionaire.
The figures, my personal circumstances, are nothing to do with whether we impoverish people by making energy prices higher. And you want to make them higher, and I don't. But what I'd say to you finally is, why don't you stand for election? Why do you think it is right to throw soup over a picture rather than standing election and seeing if you can get people to vote for your view of the world?
You're an educated man, Jacob. You know that this is how successful movements of social change happen. They must cause disruption. And Antonio Gutierrez, he's the Secretary General of the United Nations, he has said that we are on a highway to climate hell. He has said that licensing new fossil fuels is economic and moral madness. The Secretary General of the United Nations is calling for an end to all new fossil fuels. What makes you think that I have time to get into power and make these changes?
So you want to be a dictator? You don't want voters to decide.
That's absolutely not what I said, and you know that.
Why don't you stand for election? Put yourself forward and see if people want your way.
Because we don't have time. Because if I want to have a future, if I want to have a future where I can feed myself, where I can love my family,
we're not going to feed them. We're not going to feed them without fossil fuels, which are the essential fertilisers.
We need to make the change now.
I'm going to have to move on, but I hope you'll come back, because I've enjoyed this discussion and I think it's really good of you to have come on. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Phoebe. And don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, the Supreme Leader of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has abdicated. But will her successor, be any better? We'll be debating that shortly.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. George, if, as this last says, renewables are 9 times cheaper, why are we having 25% added to our energy bills to pay for it? Alan says, the current policy is madness and will drag us into being a 3rd or 4th rate world country. Renewables are not cheaper, they are linked to the price of gas. And Angela says, Jacob, you are so right. I like messages like this, actually. The more that begin, Jacob, you are so right, the better, about net zero making us poorer. It's madness to pursue this course of action. Why, oh why, are we taking notice of the green lobby when we are still allowing imports from polluters like China? Total madness. Earlier on today, the much-anticipated Scottish National Party, if you really want to annoy them, call them the Scottish Nationalists, leadership contest concluded, with former Health Minister Humza Yousaf emerging victorious with an uncannily familiar 52-48% margin in his bid to replace Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister of Scotland, following her Shakespearean fall from grace last month. Since the 2 p.m. announcement, Mr Yousaf has already called for a second independence referendum and been brutally rejected by the Prime Minister. Quite the setback for the victor who pledged to hit the ground running. So what is Scotland's future going to look like? Is the union stronger than ever, or will our beloved constitution find that it's undone? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by my distinguished panel, the historian Dr Tessa Dunlop and the barrister and former Conservative MP, Jerry Hayes. Tessa, you said you spent time in Scotland.
I'm born and bred.
Born and
Scotland. Kinlochrannoch, name like Dunlop. Went to primary school up in the Highlands, went to Pillochry High School, and did even 2 years in a boarding school, but north of the border. So,
and do you think there's good news or bad news
I
for the
served
union?
my time, and I know how fragile the union is, because if you've got a voice like mine and you go through all those schools in Scotland, I tell you what, you understand that there is, even from the get-go, before the SNP are really on the proper horizon, that there is a deep resistance towards what they understood as, and was very real, and we felt it, Anglo-dominance within the British Isles. In terms of where we're at today, it breaks my heart. I'm not English. I could never call for an English football team, but I felt quite rejected by Scotland. I am British. And actually, what you gifted the SNP, and whose leader is a kind of by the by, we'll get to him in a second, what you gifted them was their slogan for the next independence referendum, because whether it happens this year, next year, in 10 years' time, it will happen, and it'll happen in our lifetimes. Take back control. That's what English nationalism in the form of Brexit gifted Scotland. Humza Yousaf, he's been ineffective as a cabinet secretary in Scotland. He's sort of fallen upwards. But the problem is with the SNP, they have defined their campaigning government against
in a negative form against the English, and that's never going to work for Scotland.
But hasn't this transition shown that the SNP actually doesn't have the numbers to get an independence resolution through?
At the moment, no.
And that actually Brexit has strengthened the Union, because this idea that they can waltz off into the European Union for free is no longer there, that the European Union doesn't necessarily want them.
Do you know what?
It never was there. But I'm more optimistic about the Union than ever before, because the Scottish Secretary and the Prime Minister pulled an absolute blinder. Article 35. Now, a lot of Scots would say, well, this is absolutely terrible, but it was over trans, and this was a terrible political mistake that was made. That's what destroyed Nicola Sturgeon. Now, what is it? No, well, just a moment. What actually happened was, you've now got an establishment stitch-up with Yousaf, and he's going to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, there isn't an appetite, according to the polls, for unification at the moment, probably for the next 5 or so years. So the Conservatives got a wonderful opportunity to talk about the Union, to say to the Scots, look, this trans... Well, I know you may disagree, but you have a go in a moment. End of the day, we have got a great opportunity.
And Tessa, haven't they doubled down on failure? And the bigoted approach to Kate Forbes that came out was really shocking and nasty.
It has been an appalling leadership campaign. The SNP have briefly seen themselves set back with the gender reform bill and likewise with this leadership campaign. I agree, and it's going to be very hard to replace the shoes of Nicola Sturgeon. But in terms of we've got a chance, you all forgot, you Conservatives. You're the Conservative and Unionist Party, and you dropped Unionist for that narrow English agenda against Brussels, and the craziness of it. I remember sitting there. No, I'm sorry, because you're sitting there as an Englishman.
Tessa, I'm a Remainer. My people for Aberdeenshire. So just don't lecture me on this.
And Wales voted to leave the European Union too.
But this isn't about
It's not
Wales,
about
it's about...
English nationalism.
No.
It's about the UK as a whole wanting to take
It's the Union
control.
which is
But
important.
it wasn't, because that's to totally misunderstand the different nations with their separate
It's completely
agendas.
wrong. The whole rise of Scottish nationalism was whilst we were in the European Union, because it made sense to have small nations within the European Union, which it doesn't make sense to have as properly independent
Jacob,
nations.
this vote has got nothing to do with Brexit.
I agree with that.
Brexit has been done, ironically, not by your chum Boris Johnson, but by Rishi Sunak.
Well, that was last week's conversation.
I know, but
back-
you used to slag him off. But the fact is, Rishi Sunak is a grown-up. He's competent. He's not dishonest. He's actually got the economy right. You should be supporting
I'm very
him.
supportive of the current Prime Minister. I
Yes.
think he's done very well.
But Jacob, to go back to the leadership campaign today, you talk about it like it's going to serve up some fillip for the Conservative Party. In fact, the ones who might gain are Labour in Scotland. At the moment, it's...
But they're a unionist party, so to go back to your point, we're Conservative
Yes.
and Unionists. We prefer the Labour Party to do well in Scotland than the SNP,
How very
surely.
gracious of you. Well,
But of course we do, because they believe in the same really big issue that we do, and that is our single country.
My goodness, though, you've hamstrung them, though, haven't you? You've hung them up to dry. You've made their job so hard that despite failing in government, and the SNP have failed in government on education, on the NHS, on
NHS,
the
a disaster.
But that is a reminder of just how extraordinarily potent the independence message is when boys like you are in government in Westminster. That's the
Because
truism.
it grew up with Labour in government. It was Labour who set the whole system up.
I think being 70-year-old and being called a boy, I think is wonderful.
He's not 70 yet.
I'm 70.
I googled him, and actually he's very near my age. I think I need to give him some...
I am 70. I've known him since he was 18.
I don't think we need to go into these ageist conversations, but thank you to my panel, and don't forget to let me know what you think at mailmog@gbnews.uk. Still ahead, the perennial problem of lefty lawyers persists. Find out what they're up to next.
We didn't.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
all sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Melvin says, well done, Jacob. I did worry you could be covered in soup. Indeed. Thank you for letting that young lady speak. It helps us all hear the clarity of the issues. A group of 120 lawyers and barristers have signed a declaration stating that they'll refuse to prosecute climate activists for damages or disruptions they may cause. Unlike lawyers, barristers must offer their services despite their distaste of the client or case. Their representation ensures a fair trial, and this is really important. No criminal, however appalling, should go without representation in the courts. Nevertheless, many of these barristers, who most probably have worked on murder trials with guilty defendants, have now decided that our, quote, unfair laws, unquote, cause climate injustice, and therefore, by representing, say, a fossil fuel company or someone taking legal action against protesters, this will threaten the rule of law and put innocent lives in danger. This has all come amidst last week's news that says the world has been given its final warning on the climate crisis. Should lawyers bound by duty be able to justify refusing instructions for political reasons, or should they stand for Parliament and change the law? I'm joined now by human rights lawyer Shoaib Khan. Shoaib, thank you for joining me again. Don't you think it's really important that the cab rank rule is obeyed, that everybody should have the right to representation in the court?
I mean, obviously, I support the cab rank rule as far as it's been implemented for so many years. But I think there has to be limits to all sorts of rules. There does have to be some flexibility in that as well. And so especially when it comes to something as crucial as this, as you just said, now that we are having, very ultimate final warnings about what we're doing to the planet, I think it's important we stand up for that and we understand those things. And particularly, actually be supporting people who speak out against that rather than prosecuting them. And if Parliament isn't going to be doing that, if the laws are as they are, then I think it is up to a lawyer to decide whether or not they want to be part of that. So if we are going to be prosecuting these people and a lawyer feels that is in fact contributing to the destruction of the planet, then I think it's right for them to say.
But isn't this a fundamental Isn't this a fundamental change in the justice system? That I assume you agree that Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, deserved representation in the court, but that once you say the barrister can choose whether to represent or not, then how can any barrister represent a monster? Once it becomes a free choice which laws you get involved in and which ones you don't, then some very unpleasant people will be denied justice, and that undermines the rule of law more than anything.
I think it depends on what we're representing the people for. Now, the difference is, obviously, if you're representing a mass murderer, you're not representing them for or justifying or enabling them to commit mass murder. That's not what you're advising on. You're ensuring they receive a fair trial. You're ensuring that the law is implemented and enforced properly. You're ensuring the sentence is proportionate. Whereas when you're advising someone who is going
You're defending a monster who you may know is guilty. You're allowing some most evil people to get representation because everybody is worthy of representation, but you may be representing them to say things that they're not guilty when you know they are. This seems to me fundamentally undermining the rule of law. But I've got my panel with me. So I've got the criminal barrister, Jerry Hayes, and the historian, Tessa Dunlop. Jerry, how important is the cab rank rule to the rule of law?
It's incredibly important, but I would want to ask this man one simple question.
No, he's left us now,
is he
so
gone?
you can...
Well, has he done crime? Of course he hasn't. Has Jolyon Morn done crime? Of course he hasn't.
Thank you.
Have these people, these 120 people who are refusing to prosecute, ever prosecuted? No. It's a publicity stunt. You got it absolutely right. I prosecute and I defend, and I've defended some of the most appalling paedophiles and murderers that you could possibly imagine, because it's my job. Everyone deserves a fair trial. Everyone decides process. It is not for me to judge. It is for the jury to judge. And these people are undermining the whole rule of law.
And Tessa, isn't this really important? Because if the barrister has to judge the morality of the defendant, then actually innocent defendants will not get representation because the barrister will say this crime is so horrible, I'm not going to be a representative.
What barristers are saying collectively is that, on the whole, our justice system works. So whether they represent someone who is heinous or not, the expected outcome, if you're well represented by a trained barrister, will be the anticipated one that works for the rule of law. What they're calling out here in a first ever act of civil disobedience is the failure of the law to keep up with the climate change reality.
It's not the point.
It is absolutely
entirely wrong. It is not for me
point.
to decide which law I should obey and which law I shouldn't
obey.
obey.
At the moment, the way our laws are, including the policing bill that Moggy's government recently passed...
Well, it's not my government, it's the King's, but never mind.
Well, I know, but you are the legislative body, aren't you, within the House of Parliament?
But that's separate
our
from the executive,
laws
but never
cause climate injustice. They fail to keep up.
Well,
So, darling Phoebe,
if we
who
choose
sat
to
here,
ignore the law...
But then stand for election.
Yes.
But there's a way to change the law, and that's to stand for election and win a majority. But actually, the British voter wants these climate laws enforced to stop protesters gluing themselves to the ground. It has popular support. It has a democratic mandate.
Well, actually, politically, it's very divided. And you know as well as I do, when you glibly said to dear Phoebe, oh, go and stand for election, that with the first past the post system, unless you're Labour or Conservative, it is extraordinarily different. We have one Green MP.
No, that's because people don't want to vote Green. The Greens
we have double-figure Green
It's worse
support.
though. This is
That's
a red
not
herring.
true.
This
That's
is
not true, Jacob
sidetracking.
and
You
Jerry.
are putting people like me at risk, because people will say people like me are choosing to defend people who are thoroughly guilty and monsters.
The truth is,
we do our job.
This must be
we
the point.
do our job.
Yes.
It is the rule of law.
Don't
it is
use
fair.
your testosterone to shout me down, as the girl earlier made very clear.
Testosterone? At
Yes, all the
70, that went
noise
years
and
ago,
the
darling.
noise and the pointing.
You won't be shouted down. You get plenty of time to
You're
speak.
behind the curve on this. You know that.
I don't care about
the
that.
IPCC,
Hold on, Jerry, hold on.
the United Nations, we have got a climate crisis. We talked about Scotland. I grew up every year of my childhood with snow that deep. Snow now, up where I was born, is an occasion for celebration. It's so rare. And when it comes, it's in the middle of April and destroys the tomatoes. The point being is we are living in a very uncertain world. And if we want to acquire certainty again, we've got to seriously invest in our green, and we've got to listen to these lawyers. We've got to review our legal system so that actually we future-proof. Yes, and for your 6 children.
But how do you defend the lawyers who are representing monsters? Occasionally, the monsters are charged incorrectly, which is why they must have defence. Now, you're saying it is up to the hair-trigger conscience of a lawyer to decide whether somebody is worth representing.
You're talking about...
And that must undermine the whole principle of the rule of law.
You're getting very fixated with this cab rank rule, and I think it's the C28. And I understand that it's essential in order that every individual is represented. But here we have an act of collective disobedience in the face of the environment. Lawyers aren't going round saying we're going to cherry pick our cases.
But hold on, isn't it also fundamental that the law is changed by elected people, not by unelected people who decide that they will not apply the law? Jerry, I'll give you the final word on this because we're running out of time.
The final word, what you're saying, Tessa, is an absolute disgrace, which undermines the rule of law. There's an elected parliament. They decide, and we have to obey the law.
Well, they're too slow, and we know why. They've all got their fingers in the fossil fuel.
Do you believe we had to...
The likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg is overseeing the opening of a coal mine. No wonder Phoebe's throwing soup around. These kids are desperate.
All right. We have
what do you believe...
Should we obey the... Don't touch me.
Well, sorry,
excuse me. That was an assault. That was an assault.
I'm really sorry.
Nolly May Tangeray, thank you to both of my panellists, getting a little het up today. But coming up next, it's a GB News exclusive, a breakthrough for the many victims of grooming gangs across the UK. Find out after these messages from our sponsors.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your mail mogs and you don't have a lot of time for the lefty lawyers. Maureen, I don't agree with a barrister picking and choosing. Ask any of us who work in the NHS about how we cope with procedures that conflict with our religion. We have to treat everyone equally. I don't see the difference. John, I would take lawyers to court for stating climate emergency as a fact and fail to listen to voices like mine who state CO2 is vital to life on Earth and we need more, not less. I think that's a slightly contentious view. And Margaret, those who refuse to prosecute offenders of any kind should be sacked. But we're now moving on to something deeply troubling and concerning that I think you will really want to listen to, because last month GB News broadcast a groundbreaking documentary expose on the scourge of grooming gangs across the nation, from Rochdale to Shropshire. The project, spearheaded by GB News' own Charlie Peters, has today seen a further development. A survivor of such a case in Rotherham, South Yorkshire, received nearly £500,000 in compensation following civil proceedings brought forward by the victim, who felt that justice had not been done. In what has been described as a landmark legal decision, the survivor bravely proclaims her feelings that she has retaken control of the case.
Weren't I enough? But I suppose what I've got to take from that is the system doesn't really benefit victims anyway. I hope that people see this as a landmark case and that the floodgates have just opened, and I hope that it brings hope to other survivors, but also I hope that the perpetrators that commit these crimes, not historically but present, know that if this is how they're going to behave, this is what they're going to get.
And behind the operation, Charlie Peters joins me now to tell us more. Charlie, this is a really serious and difficult case. Tell me, how did you get involved? How did you find out about it? And do you think this award of £500,000 will help?
Well, I mean, I think Liz says it best. This is a landmark case, and she hopes that many more survivors will now step forward and do the same. We'll see whether or not that happens, but I of course, have great hope that they will. Because I think Liz knows, and many other survivors around the country know, that the government, social services, local authorities, the police have failed these girls. There are thousands of them. And this is an opportunity, as Liz says, to take justice into their own hands and step forward with civil proceedings where criminal proceedings and legislative matters have failed them.
Well, this is the terrible thing, that everyone who should have helped should have been able to get involved and stop these things happening, or to deal with them when they happened, let people like Liz down.
Precisely. I mean, the documentary I produced last month covered a 30-year period where many of these cases happened across the country, and in the investigation we uncovered that it is still going on today, and many of the crises first noted when the lid blew off this scandal a decade ago are still going on now. Girls are being fobbed off, the police are looking the other way. They are looking, apparently, for the perfect victim, said Sir Keir Starmer last week. In reality, they're not looking for the victims at all. I think that the police across the country are failing these girls. And so Liz, in a groundbreaking and a landmark decision, has now had the opportunity, through several years of legal support and advice, to take these civil proceedings to her abuser. And even in her case, I think it's an archetype of this failure we've seen so much. Her abuser was only jailed in 2018 after the National Crime Agency were brought into Rotherham. He was sent down for 9 years. After 2 years, he was moved to an open prison without her being told, and he was back in Rotherham within 4 years. 4.5 years from being sentenced to being back and free in South Yorkshire. Clearly, something more had to be done.
So are you saying there's still a problem with some local police forces that are not investigating this properly, hence the need to bring in the National Crime Agency?
I think the reaction has been insufficient across the country. And I have long been campaigning alongside my journalistic duties for the National Crime Agency to conduct investigations in any part of the country where credible allegations of grooming gangs have been made. And there have been many. I mean, we uncovered up to 50 different towns and cities where this is going on in our documentary last month. And I think the Prime Minister last year suggested that he would commit to that policy, and as I understand it, that might possibly occur later this year.
And how do you discover these gangs? What are the warning signs, both for the girls who are being groomed, but also for the people involved in the gangs? What should the institutions of the state be looking for?
Well, it's changed so much in recent decades. We're seeing now much of this abuse occurring online and through telephone apps that otherwise wouldn't have existed, particularly when Liz, in this case, was abused between 2002 and 2004. And a big problem that a lot of the local authorities have is it's hard to keep track of so many of these girls when the ability of the state and indeed local communities to observe them and care for them has been stripped away. And so every case is unique, every case is brings its own challenges. But the thing you have to look out for the most is a girl or a young boy, in some cases, in deep trouble.
And are they people who tend to be in care or in the protection of the state, or are they within families where this is happening?
It very much depends on the local authority. I think some people have misunderstood that all of these girls are in care. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, in the documentary, we cover the case of a girl whose parents desperately tried to rescue her from her abusers, but in fact, the father of the survivor was arrested rather than the perpetrators. So many of these girls have very active families desperately trying to recover them, but the criminal and threatening nature of these gangs is so violent that even when they seek to achieve justice for themselves, they can't.
And are there other things involved? Is there organised crime involved with the gangs? I mean, obviously this is a very serious crime in itself, but are they also involved in drug crime and other crimes of that kind?
Yes, that is often the case. And we're seeing more of that as I think this trend becomes more modern, whereby abuse is often linked with county lines and other forms of abuse. And that's why I think this civil case that we're seeing this week is so important. Because a lot of these men, they're violent criminals, but they're also quite rich. And they can acquire...
That's one thing I wanted to know.
Yeah, so
will this award be paid? Is it payable?
I understand that. I think that it's highly likely that £100,000 of it should be paid, because what Liz's legal team did that was very successful was they applied for a freezing order when they put in their papers. And the freezing order means that this perpetrator, Mr. Bostan, he can't sell any of his assets, and he owns a home. And so it's highly likely, if not almost certain, he'll have to sell his home to pay off these very high damages. And we'll see how much that happens. But again, this is very true for many other perpetrators in this story, in this national catastrophe. They make a lot of money, especially through running these kind of gangs. In one case we covered in Rochdale, for example, which was revealed a decade ago, I mean, there was a door with a list on it in a disused house in Rochdale where girls were passed around in a sort of, in the most horrific abuse. And every month, men were paying, having ticked off their names on the door. It was like a paedophile honesty box. People made money from this, okay? Many of those men are still at large, but ones that have been prosecuted and released certainly still have assets. And I believe now those assets should be stripped.
Well, Charlie, this must be really difficult work to investigate. Thank you so much for what you've been doing, because it is so important that these people are exposed, children are protected, but also the perpetrators are imprisoned and have to pay compensation. Thank you very much. That's all from us tonight. Up next is Dan Wootton. Mr. Wootton, what's in your box of tricks tonight?
Jacob, well, you've had a fiery one tonight, haven't you? I thought I might have to come in and sort of act as a bouncer or something. But we are hoping to have an equally feisty show. My take on Useless Yusuf. That's what I call the new Scottish SNP leader.
Well, that's a bit of a tongue twister for you, but as you get through the tongue twister, it'll be an enjoyable session. But we're just coming up to the weather, which is always exciting to know what's happening. It's Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Hello again. A fine end to Monday, but as we go into Tuesday, well, it's going to turn wet once again. More rain on the way from the west. A large area of low pressure actually is sitting in the Atlantic, and that's going to send various weather features our way. We've started the week with high pressure, and we keep that at least for the first half of the night, and that will allow skies to clear with just some rain and sleet affecting Shetland. Otherwise, most places dry. And with those clear spells, temperatures falling away, -3 or -4 Celsius possible for northeastern parts of Scotland. A chilly night to come as well for eastern England. But further west, temperatures actually rising through the night as the next system moves in. That will bring thickening cloud and some outbreaks of rain first thing on Tuesday. So a wet start for Northern Ireland, Western Scotland into western parts of England and Wales. Those spells of rain pushing northeastwards through the morning so that most places are damp by the end of the morning, and by lunchtime that rain reaching the far north of Scotland. With all the cloud and the rain, it's not going to feel very pleasant out there. It's going to stay on the chilly side in the east, but Northern Ireland likely to brighten up. A few showers here, but otherwise temperatures reaching 14 Celsius, and so that will feel a bit milder. Those showers also pushing into western Scotland, parts of Wales and the southwest by the end of the afternoon and into the evening. A lot of cloud remaining overnight as well, so I don't think Wednesday's going to start off particularly chilly. Perhaps northern Scotland with some breaks in the cloud. We'll see a touch of frost in sheltered spots. Otherwise, too much cloud, too much wind to lead to a frost, and in some places temperatures holding up in the double figures, especially towards the south and southwest. But it's towards the south and southwest where we've got the next system moving in, a spell of rain, an hour or two of wet weather moving through during Wednesday morning to push into Northern Ireland by lunchtime, as well as northwest England, North Wales and the Midlands. That then sweeps across the country during the rest of Wednesday, followed by an awful lot of showers on Thursday, some sunshine in between, and in the sunshine feeling.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.